We born here, we grew up here, we have the same history like Palestinians. Even whenever I sit with Palestinians, I say, look, brothers, sisters, you are oppressed by the occupation, but we as Afro-Palestinians, we are double oppressed. First as Palestinians, second because of the color.
Palestine has been inhabited for thousands of years and has been home to a diverse array of cultures, languages, and religions throughout the centuries. One of the lesser known and nearly forgotten ethnic communities in Palestine today are known as the Afro-Palestinians. The Afro-Palestinian community is small, with only around 350 to 400 people, and they can be found deep in the heart of the old city of Jerusalem, in an area known as the African Quarter. In this video, I'll explore the historical roots of Afro-Palestinians, delving into the journey of their forebears and how they came to settle in Palestine. The historical migration of Africans to Palestine primarily occurred through two distinct paths: pilgrimage and enslavement. Firstly, the tradition of pilgrimage by African Muslims, as exemplified by Mansa Musa, King of Mali, led to the establishment of Palestinian communities with roots in Sudan, Senegal, Chad, and Central Africa. These pilgrims initially journeyed for the Hajj in Mecca and later visited Jerusalem, particularly the Al-Aqsa Mosque, as early as the 12th century. This enduring tradition of pilgrimage has spanned centuries, which is why many Afro-Palestinians today can trace their lineage back to these early pilgrims arriving in the Holy Land. The alternative route that brought Africans to Palestine was through slavery, as a result of the Arab-Muslim slave trade, noted as the longest-standing slave trade in history, lasting for more than 1,300 years, and enslaving millions of Africans, forcefully taking them away from their homes to work in inhumane conditions. In the 9th century, Palestine was situated along two of the most prominent Arab slave trading networks, the Red Sea slave trade and the Trans-Saharan slave trade. The Red Sea route connected the African coast, particularly the Horn of Africa, to the Arabian Peninsula. The port of Zanzibar became a hub for this route, where enterprising Arab merchants and slave traders would purchase Ethiopians, Somalis, and Sudanese people to carry their goods back to the Middle East. On the other hand, the Trans-Saharan caravan concentrated on the West African region straddling the Niger Valley to the Gulf of Guinea to slave markets in the Maghreb and the Nile Basin. The voyage could take up to 3 months and involved inhumane conditions that saw slaves die along the way due to disease, hunger, and thirst. An estimated 50% of all slaves would die in transit. The slaves served in various roles, including as domestic servants, laborers in agriculture and mining, soldiers, administrators, and in the harems of the many sultans. When compared to the European transatlantic slave trade, which was more focused on physically strong young men to work in farms, the Arab slave trade had a lot of focus on concubinage, capturing young women and girls who would be turned into sex slaves, and it was common for Arab masters to sire children with black females. Male slaves were generally castrated, so they weren't able to reproduce, and were often selected as guards for the sultan's harem, as they could be trusted not to sleep with any of the women. This practice was common in many Muslim empires and sultanates, from the Ottomans to the Abbasids. This practice carried on for centuries, not only in Palestine but throughout the Middle East. This Arab slave trade would go on until the 20th century, but the slave trade in Ottoman Palestine would officially end in 1870, when the last slave ship was registered to have arrived. But these laws were not strictly enforced until the 1920s, when Ottoman Palestine was formally transformed into the British Mandate. The British Empire, having signed the 1926 Slavery Convention as a member of the League of Nations, was obliged to investigate, report, and fight slavery and the slave trade in all land under direct or indirect control of the British Empire. So the British policy was abolitionist. However, in reality, they were reluctant to interfere in cultural issues if they feared their interference could cause unrest. In the British report to the League of Nations for 1924, they reported that slavery existed in Transjordan but had ended in Palestine in the early 20th century after the import of slaves had stopped. According to the British, the Palestina Bedouin tribes did own African servants called Abid, but they now had some rights as the rest of the tribe members and should be regarded as former slaves, and that the same term should apply to the African female domestic servants of the many Arab noble families. After World War I, the custom of enslaved servant girls and domestic servants in Arab households simply was called employment, upon which the girls were sold as contract servants for a period between 7 and 25 years. And in 1931, there were about 150 such girls in Nablus, and about 150 more in the rest of Palestine. The British wished to ban this practice, but since many of these groups appeared to accept the situation and were not interested in protesting or changing the practice, the British preferred not to interfere in the matter. However, former slaves and their children continued to work for their former enslavers, and were still reported to be living in a state of de facto servitude well into the 1930s. Many members of the Black Palestinian community are the descendants of these former slaves and indentured servants.